at GMF, we've had a number of events on the US elections, most of which were focusing in one way or another on the hopes and concerns of our allies, partners of the United States, on the different possible outcomes of the elections. And today we're going to look at a similar issue, but listening to a number of non-Western views of some key allies and key partners, key players outside of the Europe and the United States. And we'll have a fantastic group of people here, some colleagues, friends with us. And so I'd like to welcome you all. We have Amandine Longuenot, who is a GMF non-resident fellow, but also, if I'm not mistaken, Amandine, the head of the Africa Policy Research Institute's Geopolitics and Geoeconomics program. Welcome, Amandine. Then we have Garima Mohan, who is our very own senior fellow at the German Marshall Fund's Indo-Pacific program. Hello, Garima. And last but absolutely not least, Julian Ventura, who is a Mexican career diplomat, currently on leave, and who has had senior positions in 4 administrations, including as Mexico's Deputy Foreign Secretary. Thank you for joining us, Julian, everybody. And perhaps in terms of housekeeping, what we're going to do here is I'm just going to ask a couple of questions to everybody on the key themes and of the different contingency plans that, or the sort of perspective that are predominant in your views on from these different regions of the world. But in the end, we're also going to open it up to the audience. And we're very happy for those of you who are able to join us today. So please put your questions, your comments in the chat, and we're going to come to them a little bit further down the road. So let me just, hang on, yeah. Oh, here I am. Brilliant. Hello, everybody. Lovely to join you also in picture. Talking of contingency plans, they're different. So I also have my contingency plan, which is a mobile phone. Okay, diving into it. Maybe let's start with some of the key themes. What would you say? So what would you say, what in your views respectively on the different world regions that you observe? Whereas we all know that none of these regions are a monolith or have just one opinion. And you also, but from the terms of the key players in these regions, or some of which you would like to underline, what do you think, could you just name just a few of the key themes that you think, the concerns, the hopes that are predominant in this region, to which degree they match perhaps what we can hear from Europe, where there's a lot of concern, and in particular, I would say, with regard to a possible Trump win and the contingencies that they might draw up in order to mitigate potential fallout. But maybe, Amandine, if I can start with you, if you can just give us a little bit of maybe the 3-4 key things that you think that are of concern or hopes.
Thank you, Christina. I would say for Africa, we know that there are several African leaders which have been notably active in global diplomacy. And I would say that they were focused on the economic partnership, regional stability, and rebalancing international influence. Just to give you a couple of examples, we have South Africa, Africa's president, Cyril Ramaphosa, who has been directly engaged both within the continent and beyond. We also have the Kenya's president, William Ruto, who has also made a strong diplomatic presence, engaging actively with the Western allies, especially in Washington, to promote Kenya's economic interest and regional security. And I can also give the example of in West Africa of the Ghanaian president, Nana Akufo-Addo, who has championed democratic principle and economic independence, and especially made a focus on minimizing foreign aid reliance. And usually we know Nana Akufo-Addo due to his leadership highlights within ECOWAS, the Economic Community of West African States, where he promotes regional stability, democratic governance, and economic cooperation, which are, according to me, one of the 3 main priorities now in the continent. I can just maybe give two examples. If we take the example of strengthening economic relations between Africa and the US, first we have the African Growth and Opportunity Act, the AGOA. And we know, for instance, that the objective is to bolster the US-African business ties, especially expanding initiative to boost trade and investment. And we know that, for instance, South Africa, Nigeria, and Kenya were one of the main AGOA beneficiaries country. And even if now with AGOA in its current form, most of the leaders also push for having maybe a shift towards bilateral trade agreements with specific African countries viewed as strategic partners. So I think that's also important to flag this. And the second one is definitely an African initiative, which is the African Continental Free Trade Area, the FCTA, officially launched in 2015 to foster economic integration throughout the continent. And just to mention it, this was supported by the Trump administration when the initiative was launched. Why FCTA is particularly important in the US-Africa relation is because it will be the largest free trade area since the formation of the World Trade Organization, given Africa's current population of 1.2 billion people, which is expected to grow to 2.5 billion by 2050. And just also to let you know that now we have 54 of the African member states who have signed the FCTA, except the Eritrea. And we know that initiative like the FCTA is an opportunity for the next US administration to continue effort to attract US companies for public-private partnership, invest in African infrastructures and business, like it was the case in Ghana, Kenya, Nigeria, and South Africa. Maybe a last word in terms of more broadly how we can impact all this is the diplomatic relation and the governance. I would say from an African perspective, one of the priorities definitely to change the way to collaborate with African leaders, civil society, business, and the diaspora. And we know that the Biden administration released its US Africa towards Sub-Saharan Africa in 2002, calling for transformation of the US-Africa relationship. But I think that's also important that tangible change in the US-Africa diplomatic priority have been limited by with ongoing challenge in balancing support to democracy with security interests proven by recent coup in West Africa. So I would say, and to finish, to answer to your question, that the US-Africa's strategy should extend beyond traditional focuses like governance, democracy, and security, but also to incorporate new goals related to climate change adaptation, especially financing, climate change adaptation, and all the post-pandemic economic recovery issues. Over to you, Christina.
Thank you, Amandine. You've been in between. I could hear you well, but you've been breaking up a bit. I don't know if everybody else experienced the same, or was my connection? No, you didn't. Okay. So what I hear is, so we're going to cluster a little bit. So economic relations, maybe as the three priorities you named. I heard from you mainly strengthening the economic ties and the whole package of security / geopolitical balancing. And then there's the reduction of dependency of a traditional aid relationship, you said, right? Amongst other potential areas of cooperation. Garima, maybe we can continue with you. What are, from the Indian / different Asian perspectives, the key points?
Sure. Thank you, Christina, and it's great to be a part of this amazing panel. I cover the Indo-Pacific, so I'll speak more broadly of the region and can talk specifically about India if you or the audience have questions. So the three key themes that the Indo-Pacific will look at after the US elections are, number one, the approach to China. Would the new US administration have the same approach that Biden has been following of competition with China without evolving into confrontation? Really, the question is what comes with Trump. Trump, the first term, was also focused very much on competition with China. But given the sort of unpredictable character of this administration, who knows if the balance of, working with China, competing with China without devolving into confrontation, he would be able to maintain that or not. I think the second question is isolation versus engagement with the Indo-Pacific. So Trump, with his America First policy, is the question of imposing tariffs on all, thinking of allies as burden. Countries in the Indo-Pacific would look at whether they are interested in engaging more in the Indo-Pacific or turning a little bit more isolationist. With the Harris administration, sort of similar concerns with the conflicts in Ukraine and the Middle East. How well would the administration be able to balance, commitment, dealing with these conflicts with commitments in the Indo-Pacific? And thirdly is the approach to allies and partners. Now, the Biden administration has developed a carefully calibrated network of allies and partners, sort of responding to China. India, Japan, Australia have an important place in it. The Quad, for example, but also Japan and South Korea, the trilateral with the United States. Now, this approach has sort of been invest, align, and compete, sort of taking all allies and partners with. And with Trump, of course, we know how he considers allies as burdens. He talked of the fact that Taiwan should pay the United States for its defense. So really the big question is, what role would these countries, partners, allies in the Indo-Pacific play in Mr. Trump's strategy towards China?
Terrific. Thank you. That was very concise. We're going to come back to many of these points, but let's switch to Latin America, where I presume for Mexico, and in particular Central America, there's a big difference whether Trump or Harris wins. But I'll leave it up to you, Julian, to first perhaps talk a little bit about the issues, and then we can talk about what Biden and Harris respectively would mean for each of these topics. Julian, hello and welcome. And over to you.
Thank you very much, Christina. It's a pleasure to join you from Mexico City. First of all, I would say that we have to keep in mind the tremendous geographical, demographic, economic, and political diversity in Latin America. Over 30 countries, they account for about 8% of the world's population, over 7% of global GDP. But across the board, the U.S. election is seen as particularly consequential by all the key players in the region. National concerns can vary, but in terms of specific themes, I would say that immigration, trade, security, and environmental issues would top the list. From a broader perspective, I would say that the overarching regional concern has to do with the prospects for sustained, constructive, bilateral, and multilateral engagement with whomever wins the November election in a very polarized geopolitical environment in which Latin America as a whole is not always a priority for focused attention. We're all aware how immigration, yes, it's a global and regional issue, but it's also one of the top 3 or 4 concerns for the U.S. Domestic electorate and in public opinion. We've seen a radicalization of the narrative around immigration in these weeks of a very intensive campaign, and that has raised a lot of red flags. The radical nature of the proposals by Donald Trump's campaign, whether it's mass deportations, whether it's the end of birthright citizenship, whether it's the focus on border enforcement, is a red flag in many places. And the nature of the debate has also caused the Harris campaign to shift toward a more restrictive approach on these issues. One of the hallmarks of the Biden administration is that although we have seen continuity in some of the Trump 1.0 policies and some of these areas, there has definitely been more of a proactive effort in rebuilding, activating regional approaches to dealing with human mobility and immigration management. We have seen this, of course, in Mexico, which is the main transit country toward the United States, bringing in Central America and other partners through the Los Angeles Declaration, which kind of enshrines a multilateral approach to dealing with some enforcement issues, with asylum policies, with a broader perspective on the human mobility challenges. But also this has been replicated to a certain extent in other big players in the region, such as Brazil, which had tremendous pressures coming from Venezuela at certain points as the crises, the political crises intensified in that country. So we have seen various formulas for constructive engagement that are waiting to see who continues with the mantle on immigration management. It'll be, a harsher, more enforcement-focused approach, or at least an engagement which takes into account regional and global concerns. On trade, we're seeing the same thing. That would be the second top issue. We are talking about a region that is highly integrated into the global economy. 3 G20 members are from Latin America: Brazil, the largest economy in the region; Mexico, second economy, and also a partner that is highly integrated into the North American economic market, which accounts for 1/3 of global GDP, and Argentina as well. Other countries that depend on preferential access to the US market, and of course, key stakeholders in the multilateral trading system, where we have seen continuity in some multilateral policies that have blocked the normal functioning of key areas of the WTO, particularly the dispute settlement mechanism. So when we look at these issues through the prism of rising protectionism in the US, the evolution, as Garima mentions, of US-China dynamics and how that impacts a region which has almost across the board China as the number 1 or number 2 trading partner, and also more emphasis on industrial policy, export controls on sensitive technologies. This is the other sort of key area in which the region is looking to see what happens in the next week after the election. Finally, in the issues I mentioned, energy is also a key driver. There are big concerns in the climate change agenda, for example, by the Caribbean basin countries, where we have some of the most vulnerable nations to climate change dynamics. We have Brazil, which is hosting the multilateral climate change process next year in the what would be the COP 30, in which with the experience from the first Trump administration, where we saw the US withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, ending funding support to some key mechanisms in the global and regional climate change agenda, potentially in jeopardy. We know, for example, that Brazil and the US have a very dynamic climate change agenda, including on deforestation in the Amazon Fund, which is one of the hallmarks of President Lula's environmental agenda. And these 3 issues depend in many ways from constructive engagement by the US. And that's the big question that we're going to see coming up in November, whether you look at the 3 issues I have mentioned or through a broader prism to include security and overall development and equality issues that are top of mind in most Latin American societies.
That's terrific, Julian. Thank you so much. You've actually set 4 issues, not 3, but I clustered them all. Let me find a few commonalities here. I think I really like the way that you structured this in terms of these are some of the more narrow concern in the region or some of the countries, such as immigration, and then there is also a meta layer, so to speak, of concerns that relate to the style of engagement that will of the future U.S. administration that will set the tone for in the international system. and the prospects of multilateralism in the years to come. And also, Garima hinted at the start that what the kind of the kinds of what allies and partnerships mean. No, so this is something that is cross-cutting through all world regions. I think that the big question marks is what will be the future U.S. administration's attitudes toward partnerships, to alliances, to institutions, to multilateral governance, all of which we need in order to tackle many of these issues that are very surprisingly common to all of these world regions that we're talking about. So I would like you all, if you may, to flesh out a little more the issues that you have mentioned with regards to how would this be affected, how would this, like in a relatively staccato way, given the time that we have, how would these issues be affected by under a Harris administration or a Trump administration? Anything that stands out? Would there be big differences? And if so, what would they be? Maybe go in reverse order. Julian, you want to go ahead?
Thank you, Christina. Well, definitely we'll see a change in tone and styles, which counts for a lot when we talk about dynamics of engagement. If we take the experience from the first Trump administration, of course, we saw a more confrontational, unilateralist focus, unpredictable in many ways. Uncertainty was the name of the game, as we saw the way that the U.S. administration tackled some of these issues. I think we saw it clearly in immigration, whether it was a very narrow focus on border issues, where there was a significant pressure for the U.S. Partners to do more to stem the flow of migrants in a very challenging environment after very restrictive policies that were imposed through executive action in the administration. And almost always, a very transactional focus in which if the White House didn't perceive progress in some areas, there was always a threat to act in other areas that were priorities for the partners. In Mexico, in the case of Mexico, it was trade and tariffs, which is something that is a hallmark of what we saw during President Trump's term in office, and which in a way continued on toward the Biden administration. When you see that you have 11 million undocumented migrants from all regions of the world in the U.S. and a very aggressive, very jingoistic narrative in the U.S., this raises issues that are very concerning. We see different modalities, although we don't know much about specific policy actions across a wide range of issues from a potential Harris administration. We do have a sense that there would be more of a continuity in the way that this narrower bandwidth on key issues that are important in domestic politics in the U.S. are dealt with. If we take the case of China, for example, there is a strong bipartisan consensus in taking competition with China through a narrower policy focus that emphasizes domestic resilience in the United States, but there has also been a concerted effort to maintain engagement dynamics at all levels with Beijing. That would not necessarily be true in a different outcome in the United States. Most Latin American countries have the challenge of balancing their economic interests with the need to ensure as much convergence as possible on the U.S.'s strategic interests. So the issues would not go away, or the policy approaches in a certain sense, but the way we deal with them will definitely change dramatically. And the uniform reality, and to close on this, is that there is a realization in the region that regardless of who wins the election, you have to pursue engagement with the next U.S. administration, whether we're talking about a narrow, more constructive bandwidth or a more unilateral approach for the next 4 years.
Thank you, Julian. Garima, how does it look like in the Indo-Pacific?
I
Lots of
fully
change
agree.
or not so much?
I fully agree with most of the points that Julian brought up. There is, as he mentioned, a bipartisan consensus on the fact that China is a threat to the US, but a Harris or a Trump administration would have very different policies of engagement, very different areas that they prioritize in this engagement with China. Similarly, particularly for India, there's also a bipartisan consensus in the US of the importance of India. However, in the Biden administration strategy, India played a very important role as a democratic counterbalance to China, as a preferred tech partner, really that elevated India, even though it's not a former ally, very close to US allies in the region. Now, the big question is, would this continue under the Harris administration? Would she see the importance? But more broadly, I think she is likely to continue the policy of working with partners and allies. But with Trump, there are lots of question marks, particularly the question of tariffs and on H-1B visas for highly skilled immigrants, particularly for partners like India, that is an issue. But it also sort of sours the relations between allies and partners. I mean, you can say that you would work with them, and in fact, Trump did. They actually sort of revived the Quad. We're very sort of closely working with India, Australia, Japan, the Quad partners. But these sort of differences, they do sour relations. And I wonder if middle powers in the Indo-Pacific, while continuing engagement with the US, would perhaps want to work more with each other, reduce some dependencies on the US, because we do not know if Trump ratchets up the rhetoric leading to confrontation with China, or he strikes a deal with China, right? That is also quite possible. So in terms of hedging bets and looking to work with other partners, that is something we would definitely see in case of a very transactional foreign policy of President Trump. Again, overall constructive engaging with minilaterals that have become quite prominent in the Indo-Pacific, the Quad, Trilats, where the US has participated very nimbly under the Biden administration. Again, these questions of what sort of approach would you follow with the region? And then I think the competition with China is sort of well-rooted now in the region as well. So it's not the US, India has its own border problems, Japan has its problems, Australia has sort of faced a lot of bullying from the Chinese, as well as many of the ASEAN countries. So I think the need to engage with the US is very prominent and very present. But on a lot of questions like critical and emerging technologies, defense partnerships, you need a partner that you can rely on, that is trustworthy, and that would throw many of these equations into question. One thing, though, is like for countries like India that have a relationship with Russia, this, of course, will not be a question under Trump. And how would Trump deal with Russia-China coordination would be very different than how a Harris administration would deal. I think this is the most pressing challenge in the Indo-Pacific currently, with Moscow working as a junior partner to Beijing.
Thank you, Garima. I'd like to come back to the hedging question, the contingencies on these different themes that are emerging in a bit. But Amandine, how would Trump versus Harris, how much of a difference would that make on the themes that you highlighted in the African context? And feel free to pop out, pick examples of specific countries, so to add a little bit of nuance to the debate.
Okay, thank you. I also totally agree on what has been said. I mean, we already have an idea of what Trump approach could look like in Africa. I mean, the transactional approach was mentioned. That's meaning that we're going to have US prioritizing economic and strategic benefits of a long-term partnership based on shared values. We know also the question of having the Trump's America First agenda is likely to reduce US engagement in multilateral efforts, emphasizing immediate US interest and strategic competition over long-term collaboration with Africa. I think what is also interesting of having another Trump administration is the impact it could have on the authoritarian leaders, and especially what the EU, the European Union, is trying to do at the moment, meaning trying to again support democracy in the Sahel, for instance. And we know that this preference for authoritarian leaders may definitely change the role the EU is playing in the region, but also the way these authoritarian leaders are perceiving themselves as potential partners for the US. I think that we know that some African leaders might prefer the straightforwardness of Trump, the fact that he's more transparent, is direct, compared to other Western allies or Western partners like France, like Germany, which are often viewed as hypocritical or these double standards. But I think now we are really in some kind of transition phase between different perspectives from different African states, different African leaders. And this new Trump administration could increase the divides between this, let's say, different way of perceiving African agency. You have a very strict way to present how African leaders should now make sure that their voice are better heard, using some kind of very strong sovereignty discourse. And the previous way we try to push African agency, meaning that to show that Africans have interests, but they have a soft way to support them. And we also know that the potential second term of Donald Trump could also revert US policy to one characterized by nationalism, unilateralism, and we'll still have, again, also a question mark of what could be the role of Africa and how some initiative started by the Biden administration could be jeopardized in some way. We also know that at the opposite, what the Harris approach could look like. We know that definitely it will be the continuity with the Biden administration when we talk about US strategy towards sub-Saharan Africa, focus on multilateralism, climate change, fostering partnership with African countries. This is also the reasons why I mentioned the need to change the relationship with civil society, because we know that Harris policy would likely maintain to focus on human rights, women's empowerment, LGBTQ plus rights. And we saw it during her visit to Africa last year. We know that the focus will be on climate change, which is a key question now definitely on the African continent, re-engagement with international agreements, and support for African initiative, climate initiative especially. And that this is also why I said that we can see a different way of preserving, the diplomacy in Africa, because Harris' approach will likely be more diplomatic, inclusive, and emphasizing collaboration with African actors to address what she can identify as our shared challenge, but at the same time positioning the US as a supportive partner in African long-term development. And we know that the question is not to do more, but to do better. And I think that Harris' approach is going into this way. And lastly, I think that there is also important, agenda like increased digital connectivity, which is also something important. I talked before about the economic dimension. To give you concrete example, I think, for instance, we know that now, based on considering the last visit of the Kenyan president, having Biden or having Harris or having a Trump administration will be exactly the opposite. We know that Biden designated Kenya as the major non-NATO ally. We know that Ruto visits strengthen this effort to position the country as one of the African leading voice on issues such as trade, security, climate, and finance, and to position Kenya as a prime destination for the US investments. So we know that if we have a new Trump administration, the impact on the EU-Kenya relationship will be totally different, because once again, we're going to have a more transactional relationship, and maybe less economic collaboration, cooperation, and less multilateral engagements. Same for South Africa. We know that the impact, for instance, on the rand, the local currency, could have having Harris or having Trump could make a difference, a huge difference. And just to finish, I would say that for many Africans, I think what is also important is that there is no real difference between democratic and Republican administration in practice. Then there is a lot of African expectation of US administration, and they had, especially before the Barack Obama presidency, and they know that now, despite commitment from the Biden administration to elevate African voice in global discourse, many feel that the administration has not lived up to this promise. So I think that now part of the effectiveness of the future US-Africa relationship will depend the capacity of this next administration to address African urgent needs and to foster collaborative relationship rather than continuing outdated approach. And again, as I said, to do more, not to do more, but to do better. And once again, it will depend on, we have this division now in the continent between the rising of authoritarian regime and, the one who are the leaders who are still struggling to protect the democracy. So definitely, depending on what kind of administration we're going to have, we will see a huge difference for pushing all this team and all this topic I mentioned before. Over to you, Christina.
Thanks, Amandine. So I think it's pretty clear that there's a lot of nuance coming out of this. It's not we're not one direction. There are concerns and hopes with regard to both candidates, actually. Not only, many overarching ones with regard to Trump, but also some with regard to Harris. For example, what Garima mentioned about the bandwidth and the balancing with the Ukraine war and so on. So I would like to come back, if you who are here listening to you to submit your questions, comments in the chat now, so we can put them out. I'm going to put them to the speakers in a bit. So look, talking about the contingencies, yeah. Several of you have mentioned, for example, that these hedging elements. For example, Julian, you mentioned that the anticipation of a potentially more aggressive Trump immigration policies are actually triggering more proactive policy changes in some Latin American countries. I don't know. I think Garima it was you who said that there's, mentioned the boost of regional cooperation, of South-South cooperation that we can see actually all around the world, partially as a result of this anticipation of an international environment in which alliances need to be diversified in order to be effective, because you can no longer rely as much on your traditional alliances, no? Something which by some has in Europe been dubbed the Trump effect, which some, was portrayed as the push that the anticipation of a specific US government is going to give to us, and, give us this push in order to develop faster. Now, I'd like to ask you, so if we can't generalize, we won't, but if in all these different areas that we've mentioned, be it security, trade, immigration, all of global governance, if all of this, if you can say there's a certain frustration speaking out that you can no longer rely on your US leadership, which is not anything new. But what is the role of alternative outfits of multilateralism? So we just had the BRICS summit which commentators, like as one of the most significant ones, there was for example, Garima, maybe you want to say something about that, an agreement between China and India, but also in more broad terms. Do you make any connection between these alternative multilateral structures being boosted at this moment in anticipation of a potential Trump 2 administration? How would you interpret, what weight would you give this or also the G20 and other formations in solving all of these issues that you've raised? Any of the few three want to come in? Just
maybe I can start. I think BRICS summit is also BRICS in general. There's been a lot of focus on it, but often people don't look at how many differences there exist between BRICS members, particularly the India-China conflict, the role Russia is playing. It used to work with India to sort of balance China, but now the other way is happening. So I do think there's some nuance needed in the conversation around BRICS, and if it does provide a very useful or important alternative to many of the existing global governance institutions. But I think sort of thinking more broadly, and these are just some ideas, I do not know how these will pan out, but a lot of what is driving Russia towards China and the sort of coordination we see with them in BRICS and SCO and other formats is because of Russia's current isolation. And I wonder if a Trump policy of engagement, how that would change the dynamics between Russia and China, for example. And I do wonder what role that relationship will play and how the Harris administration would continue on the question of Ukraine and South Africa, for example, or India, or many countries, Indonesia and others, do have ties with Russia, not only arms dependence, but also, for example, oil that India now has been buying, etc. So I do think that on that question, there are different views and different sort of ideas that exist, and I wonder how the next administrations, both Harris and Trump, would solve that question. But on what you were actually asking about hedging and how would other partners work. So for a lot of countries in the Indo-Pacific, particularly India, the question is, how do you compete with China? So it's not just US that's competing, India is competing for political influence, economic influence, and we see, for example, US and India working together with countries in Africa, or India investing more in those ties, as well as in ASEAN. Japan is quite invested in providing alternatives to China. What happens with the Trump administration where the US decides these investments are not for us and we move away? I think that space will be filled by these middle powers who do not want to squander the sort of benefits they're trying to gain in these regions by providing alternatives to China. Same with the Quad. The Quad has now created so many investments in terms of service provision, for example, vaccines, and investing in areas of sort of building capacities in order to resist China. What would happen? Would the next administration, Trump administration, see these investments as worthwhile, or would they consider them to be not super important? We don't want to spend US money. I think they will, even though, because connectivity is also an important agenda for the Republican side. But I do think that if the pace of the US slows down, the other countries would try to be the pacemakers here, right? Like India and other partners will want to do more in the region in case of sort of US withdrawal. This is more a thought experiment because we don't know who will be the people who would man the Trump administration. Is it the Project 2025 people who perhaps have some sort of policy than many people who came and Trump wanted? So these are more conjectures or thought experiments at this point.
Martin, Julian, if you.
Yes, I can say a word. I think what is also interesting from an African perspective is that the US is obsessed by, what we call from the West's the new Cold War in Africa. And I think this is also parts of the one important thing, because it seems that all the US initiative in Africa is playing catch up against China longer run and more comprehensive engagement strategy, such as the Belt and Road Initiative. So the question is also how the new administration, and I think this is maybe how we can just see if there is any difference between the two administrations, is how they will be engaged in this, what is the so-called new Cold War? Because from an African perspective, there is no Cold War in Africa. There is just an opportunity for African governments to broaden their international partnership for trade and security cooperation. If you look at what we can call the Africa Plus Summit, we obviously the China, the US, the UK, the France, but we have Russia, India, Japan, Turkey. Now we have Saudi Arabia. So I think this is also the connection we can do with how the US next administration will engage with global powers in Africa, because it was initially one important key players. I think that, and Garima mentioned them, the BRICS has also an influence on African politics. Particularly, we have South Africa, which actually which is a long-standing member. South Africa's president has strengthened the ties with China, positioning South Africa as a key partner through strategic initiative, framework, investment in renewable energy and technology. So once again, what this partnership with the US look like with a Trump administration? I think that if we talk about BRICS from an African perspective, there is also one important point to mention. This is the recent inclusion of Egypt and Ethiopia, which highlight growing engagement and potential impacts on the continent, as we mentioned, on the South-South cooperation. We know that the BRICS Plus carries insignificant demographic and economic weights, even if I agree this is a very I mean, all the countries are very different, but we should not ignore that it's nearly half of the world population in the BRICS Plus now. We know that the African Union, the headquarters is based in Ethiopia, which is a strong ally. We know that Egypt dominates the global diplomatic engagement with 1,031 diplomatic mission abroad, and which is also a member of various international organizations. And the question also of Trump versus Harris administration is also the question of what will be the engagement with the African Union, for instance, which gained in 2023 a permanent membership to the G20. And we know that the African Union remain a key regional player. Currently, we know that if we talk about the regional players, we have Egypt, South Africa, Morocco, Algeria, and Nigeria, who are contributing to almost half of the budget of the organization. We know that within the African Union, African states work on common African position for global issues such as United Nations Security Council reform, climate change, humanitarian effectiveness, and migration. So we still have, a lot of question mark also when we talk about multilateral diplomacy, and also the role of the next administration for supporting all this global issue.
Yes.
Thank you, Amandine. There's so many issues. Well, yeah, and also just to say, if everybody wants to put a question also in the chat, we're gonna come to that right after Julian's contribution. Julian.
Thank you, Christina. Very, very briefly, perhaps as a segue into the questions from the people who have joined us. If we take an uncertain outlook in the United States, a more inward turn, perhaps more uncertainty in terms of a multilateralist approach, and in the broader context, a very polarized international environment that makes that reflects or heightens some dysfunctionalities in the international system. There are special challenges and responsibilities for countries in what we call this very diverse grouping of the global South. The global South has been very effective at kind of making an X-ray of things that are wrong, what the challenges are in the world, the inconsistencies, contradictions, double standards. But I think it's very important for us to move toward presenting some, developing some specific solutions to global challenges. We've talked about some of the mechanisms. It is not a perfect instance, but I think the G20 is perhaps the most representative for at least giving some policy directions on these very complicated issues. India hosted the summit last year. Brazil will host it less than 2 weeks after the US election. And of course, South Africa will host it next year. There is the African Union has now joined as a member of the G20. So there's an issue of, a forward-looking direction on representativeness. But how can we use those fora to try to set some policy directions that take us a little bit away from north-south polarization and takes us more toward a bridge building approach, whether it's issue driven, whether it's coalitions of like-minded countries from different regions and different profiles to tackle some of these things. That is going to be the challenge. What can key players in the G20 do with the Nordic countries? What can we do between Europe and Africa or Europe and Latin America in a very creative way to tackle and present and deliver specific results on specific challenges? Yes, the big picture is very dire. We have big conflicts, big challenges in the humanitarian agenda, in the climate agenda. But how can we take this one step forward to start making a bigger difference on those issues that are most top of mind within our societies?
My screen is very small. Thank you. Thank you, Julian. Actually, this was already the wrap up for the whole, I think, for the Seoul event, let this election be a catalyst for a Southern agency to find constructive solutions. But I think now is the time to take a couple of questions. There was one question in the chat for Garima. How is the outcome of the US elections going to impact briefly?
I think this is the question on Myanmar. Right. I think it would be broadly the trends that we discussed, more engagement with South Asia, Southeast Asia more broadly under Harris administration, and no real change under Trump. I mean, no real engagement. We've seen that as a trend across the board. I think there's some more engagement with particularly Indian Ocean countries, where the competition with China is very central, but somehow I don't see Myanmar figure in most of these conversations.
Thank you, Garima. And the question that maybe we can in a quick way pose to everybody. There's a question that says, how does the current U.S. administration stance position towards Israel? What does it say? Distance or alienate the governments of your region from the United States? Amandine, maybe very quickly, is there anything on the, I guess, I presume that this question points towards the US policy in the war in Gaza, Palestine, and so on, the whole Middle East dossier. Is there anything you want to say about that? Does this play a role? Amandine, Julian, Garima? Amandine, please.
Julian, you can.
No, well, it raises the question of when you look at global conflicts and when you look at the situation in Ukraine and the situation in Gaza and now in southern Lebanon, it just gives fuel to this narrative of double standards in terms of commitments to international law and a rules-based order, and that discrepancy or that dissonance that has. That reverberates strongly in a lot of our societies, in a way affects the momentum toward dealing with some of the bigger global challenges that are common to all our societies, but are not necessarily in crisis mode or top of mind in the media attention. So there is a direct relationship in terms of how that focus can, on very tough, very difficult, humanly tragic situations in Ukraine and in the Middle East distracts or in a way weakens the muscle that we have to address issues that came to the fore during the pandemic. Everybody was talking about inequality, and everybody was talking about the SDGs and progress on some of these structural challenges for humanity. And it's definitely something that if it's not addressed or dealt with in 2025 at least, although the issues are very pressing, we're going to see less of a disposition for cooperative engagement on issues that are common to all societies.
Can I come in very quickly there? And it's not just the US, it's also the EU's credibility that's really falling by the response to currently what is going on in Palestine, Lebanon. I mean, this is developing into a bigger regional conflict, and a lot of Europeans, when they tried to find sort of consensus or get more support for Ukraine, came across this sort of reluctance, and that underlines the fact that these are double standards, and there are different policies for different parts of the world. I mean, the South African case in the ICJ, and not saying anything on Ukraine, is like a very clear example of the differences that are still pretty prominent.
Amandine, you want to add anything?
Yeah, no, the only things I wanted to say is that we know that, as we said, Africa is a rising continent, and we know that it's also interesting partner for African country to increase trade relation. The only important event is that Israel wanted to have an observer status in the African Union, and we know that we had a lot of very heated debates within the organization. So once again, this brings me to the idea of how the US is playing and is actually investing in the African Union as a partner, because we know that this definitely, we had the division between, different African nations within the African Union about what will be the position African states should have toward Israel. So I would say that not directly linked to the US policy, but mostly linked to the Israel-African states relationship, less direct and not directly linked to the US.
Thank you, and I think you've all outlined very well how the rapid succession of Ukraine and Gaza and contrast of both cases have embodied in many ways these larger themes of inequality and of double standards and of different approaches to partnership that we've talked about, while not being the only examples. Unfortunately, we are at the end of this discussion. I would like to thank you, the three of you, very much, Julian, Amandine, Garima. And let me also thank you, all the participants, for being with us. And last but not least, of course, I'd like to give a thanks to my colleagues who were instrumental in making this thing and making this event happen. Hermine Sam, William Stewart Wood, and Alexandria Chastine. Thank you all very, very much. And I wish you a lovely rest of the afternoon, morning.